You know, I get asked pretty much all the time, why is it that Ireland in the medieval era is not centralized like other kingdoms in Europe? Which for me is kind of strange given that every single kingdom in Europe has barons fighting each other. I mean, is that not the reason why we love the medieval era so much? But at the same time, I do understand where they're coming from. Why is Ireland so fractured? Why do they have all these kingdoms? Why are they always murdering each other? Which is reasonable, I understand. Especially coming out of the Viking Age. In the Viking Age, we had what we call the majority of the time a sort of over king, a high king, or ardria, whatever you want to refer to as, even King of Ireland. There's always a form of central government with the King of Tara. But as we go into the high medieval period, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. What we have, in fact, is splinter groups that start to emerge. Where did these splinter groups come from? Well, coming into the 12th century, we still have more or less a centralized king within the O'Connors. The O'Connors dominate the country. Rory O'Connor ends up having a civil war with the MacLucklans over the crown kingship of Ireland. This ends with the O'Connors dominating the war. However, one person who is not so much of a sore loser, just somebody who's terrified of his own family's lands and territories being lost now that he was on the losing side of this Irish civil war, decides to go and get support in one of his neighbouring kingdoms of England and asks King Henry II to support him in a second war against the O'Connors. Henry II at the time is actually quite busy, but says he can take mercenaries out of Wales. Well, anywhere in England. Diarmaid MacMurrough decides to go off to Wales and get some Canterbury Normans to go and assist him. Diarmaid MacMurrough goes back to Ireland and he ends up winning this slight little civil war of his called the Norman Invasion of Ireland, 1169. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it's quite a massive event in Irish history because it changes the whole game. No longer will we have this centralized government that we had, and now it will be completely replaced with Diarmaid MacMurrough. Or would it? Before Diarmaid MacMurrough knew what had happened, Henry II had arrived from England into Ireland. You see, something had happened in England and Henry II needed a reason to escape the murder of Canterbury, and Henry II decided to arrive in Ireland and sort out the problem that was happening in Ireland. So he decided to make it so that he would have no rivals in Ireland, and to do so he invited a ton of Anglo-Normans into Ireland to sort out the Cambro-Normans, the Welsh Normans as they would also be called. Therefore, anytime a Norman decided to get ahead of the pact, another Norman from another rival faction would end up killing him, and so it did cause pure anarchy inside the country of Ireland, and vice versa. Because Diarmaid MacMurrough had reinvigorated the civil war in Ireland, all the rival clans against O'Connor had all risen up and all had started fighting amongst each other. So Ireland was left in anarchy, where anytime somebody within the bunch had taken supremacy or declared themselves King of Ireland, such as Brian O'Neill or Marcy Fitzgerald or even Hugh de Lacy, they would end up being executed or killed or even just knocked to the side. Marcy Fitzgerald was one of the last Norman knights to declare himself King of Ireland. Allegedly, anyway. Regardless, Marcy Fitzgerald and possibly many Gaelic nobles had started to notice this whole medieval feudalism just didn't work in Ireland. And another solution needed to be highlighted. And the Normans and the Gaelic living on the Isle of Ireland needed to find a new solution on how to govern their own country. The solution, which would be found much later on in the medieval period, would be seen in the Magna Carta, which had appeared first in 1215, when King John was just an absolutely terrible leader, and the barons felt that they needed to imply more rule of their own in their own country. Ireland was sort of an afterthought in 1217 when they set up the Irish Parliament. However, throughout the entire 13th century, the Normans living in Ireland never really needed it. They only really used it to enforce their own laws and will within their own people. That's it really. The English at the time didn't feel any need to go against the system. And that's because even if the Normans at the time in the 13th century were fighting amongst each other, with the English king himself, they were actually quite content and actually happy with his ruling. That would all change with the Scottish War of Independence when Edward II would take over, but I'll talk about that in a second. First, I just want to go back to the Gaelic, the native Irish, and how they're doing. The Gaelic, on the other hand, who were still fighting amongst each other, needed to reinvent themselves. Throughout the 13th century, the Gaelic clans, the native Irish, would continue butchering and hacking each other. Around 1250, the Gaelic had elected Brian O'Neill as their head. However, there were so many Gaelic going and opposing against it, eventually Brian O'Neill would end up being killed by his own, fighting against the Normans at the Battle of Down. It was the exact same problem they had when they invited Edward the Bruce from Scotland to become their new king in Ireland as well. Many of the armies that were fighting against Edward the Bruce were in fact other Gaelic clans that opposed Edward the Bruce being their king. Kingship and feudalism in Ireland just wasn't working. Going into the 14th century, the Gaelic were still subdivided and they needed a form of governance to help them move along this. It just so happened at the same time, in the period of Edward II, the Irish barons were also starting to get put off by the English crown. You see, in the middle of Edward the Bruce's invasion of Ireland, the Irish barons felt very depleted. You see, Edward II of England was starting to take more and more out of Ireland and not giving back. The Irish barons didn't really like this, and this problem would get more worse as they entered into the period of the 100 Years' War, a war between England and France, with Scotland coming down to aid France as well. Ireland and the Irish barons found more and more of their resources being taken and depleted. The Irish lords, the Anglo-Irish, had decided to take root within their own Irish Parliament, which in fact over the 13th century had been given more and more power to go independent from the English crown. You see, the Irish Parliament was set up to govern Ireland in itself while the English king went off and did what he wanted. He never thought that the Irish barons would use the Irish Parliament to go independent to the English king. And during the 100 Years' War, that's what started to happen. Over time, the Irish Parliament started to get more and more power. The clergy was put towards the Irish Parliament in 1277 when they were literally told, if you have any grievances or problems, you should turn to the Irish Parliament. And that's what they did. And in the Scottish War of Independence, the Irish would take it on themselves to hire their own men and start setting up their own militia. This was originally justified to solve local problems, a local army to fight against a local Gaelic clan. That made perfect sense. The only problem is going into the 14th century, the Normans and the barons would rely on this more and more and turn away against England. So when England came looking for resources from the Irish Parliament would refuse to do so, using the laws that the English had put into place for them to solve local problems against them. This would come to a head in 1377 when Irish lords were summoned to the English Parliament, but outright the Irish lords would refuse to comply, saying, "According to the liberties, privileges, rights, laws and custodies of the Church and of the land of Ireland, the Irish Parliament cannot oblige to attend Parliament or councils in England. This statement would be repeated over and over again throughout 1375 all the way up to 1380s. This was basically the Irish saying, even with letters written to the English Parliament and the English King, this was the Irish, both the Irish nobles and the Irish clergy, saying to the English government, we're not playing ball. We are going somewhat independent to you. We'll still recognise the English King as the Lord of Ireland, but we're kind of going to do our own thing. Because how the system worked at the time was that barons all had to be together to agree on a certain matter. And if that baron wasn't there, that certain matter couldn't be resolved. And as I said earlier before, the Irish Parliament was there to solve local problems. The problem is that the English King wanted something from his Irish barons and they were refusing to do so, using the old system from the 13th century. So then becomes the next argument. A political argument for most, because the English King rarely ever had a force to enforce himself onto the Irish Parliament. So most of it was politically fought inside both the English and Irish Parliament, and that was which is superior in Ireland, the Irish Parliament with its barons, or the English King's supremacy over his realm of both England, Ireland and France. At the same time, the Gaelic were also reorganising themselves as well. The Gaelic, instead of having a rua, a king, started to use the word Taoiseach, the same word we see today in the Irish Parliament, meaning Prime Minister. Or in that period, it was used as head of clan, which is really interesting. It's no longer king, it's the head of the clan. And his prince at the time, his Taoiseach, as it would be called, is still used today as well as vice prime minister. And the same was used here. It was kind of the prince of the clan. This is really exciting that we start to see assemblies starting to appear as well. This was the form of the Irish Parliament that we see more of a Gaelic version of, which is massively interesting. Some of these assemblies would be held in courtrooms or in hills, and there a local elected people would start to come. Even the head of the clan was elected. He was no longer chosen because he was the strongest or he was the greatest. He was no longer chosen because he was the greatest of his fathers. He was now elected amongst the clan. Most of the time it was the person with the biggest army or had certain features that was highlighted within the clan. But it's interesting that this was an elected member. So what we start to see is the same foundation all over Ireland, that it's gone more into organised assemblies. Even the word today that we used for Oireachtas, meaning assembly. This is really fascinating. So how assemblies worked is that in the Gaelic world, these were people who were elected in. The Irish Parliament, on the other hand, the Anglo-Irish, would have their barons who would own the land. Obviously the barons were brought in from father to son compared to the Gaelic society, which was 100% elected in. Then in the Irish Parliament you had certain people who had grievances from the church to various settlements such as towns and cities. They themselves would have been voted in from the locals as mayors, so on and so forth, to go to the Irish Parliament, the Assembly, and there they would give in what their grievances were to the local barons. Because during the 14th century, it really starts to get really blurry between the assemblies and the Irish Parliament. The Norman lords needed to start adapting to both the Gaelic laws and their own Norman laws, and so bastard laws in between started to evolve out of that. This is what some historians refer to as Anglo-Irish laws, where the Irish lords would take on both English laws and Gaelic laws and adapt situations in front of them. The barons, with their lawyers and fellow churchmen, would come up with local solutions. You see, this was all meant to be local, except for the Irish Parliament had taken more and more power over time, away from the English king. This would all come to a head in 1366, when the Statutes of Kilkenny had forced the Irish barons into accepting a law which segregated the English and the Irish. However, this didn't work in reality. Such families like the Fitzgeralds had already married into the O'Briens, the McCarthys, and the O'Connors, so these laws weren't going to work. It was same pretty much with every single Irish lord living in Ireland at the time. They had all married into the locals. Their first language was now Gaelic, and a lot of them were secretly taking up the local dress and customs. That's just how it worked. And so one of the problems that they had was the Statutes of Kilkenny. The second problem still was currency. Because Ireland wasn't separate from England, they still had the same currency. So England was still able to put their hands into Irish pockets and take resources out, no matter how much the Irish Parliament tried to stop this. However, luck would be on their side. When the War of the Roses had kicked off in England, the Yorkists would be looking for support, and the Fitzgeralds would support the Yorkists only if they recognised the Irish Parliament independent from Ireland. Because the Yorkists had no other choice, they had signed that agreement. So in 1490, the Irish Parliament had gone independent from the English for a short period of time. This would become even stronger when O'Donnell had unified the North and the O'Connors had unified Connaught. In 1464, a great assembly was called in Dublin where the Fitzgeralds, the O'Donnells and the O'Connors would all go to Dublin and forge a great alliance together, basically unifying all the clans and dynasties into one. However, this would massively backfire when the Tudors would eventually win the Wars of the Roses. Their first sight was obviously on Ireland and reclaiming the Irish Parliament and taking full control. Henry VII didn't hesitate, sending Poynings over to the Irish Parliament and forcing them into the Poynings Law, recognising Henry VII as the supreme king of Ireland. However, this time this would be physically forced into the Irish Parliament. Poynings had an army, and it wouldn't be long until he would be down fighting off the Fitzgeralds, which would be restarted in 1534. However, this time Henry VIII, Henry VII's son, would get himself kicked out of the papacy, so he no longer had to play by the rules. Therefore, he declared himself King of Ireland and also the head of the Church of Ireland. This then gave him the power to completely control the Irish Parliament, and for the next 400 years, Ireland would have to fight British rule. Guys, enjoyed that, and it answers a lot of the questions you guys were having over the Irish Parliament during the medieval period. After you guys asked me a whole load to get a TikTok up and going, finally have it up and going this week. I will be putting up a TikTok a day. Also, if you feel like you don't want to have a TikTok for obvious reasons, I'm going to be posting everything that happens on TikTok over on YouTube anyway under the shorts. So you're not going to miss anything. Regardless, thanks very much guys and enjoy.